Welcome to a special episode of Kaijuvision, a podcast and YouTube channel about the appreciation of kaiju and tokusatsu movies and discovering their historical and cultural value, bringing you film reviews with an emphasis on international affairs and the history and culture of Japan. I'm Brian Scherschel, and I'm from Fort Wayne, and Kaijuvision has been made here since its creation in 2017. I received my master's in international relations at Indiana University-Bloomington's O'Neill School of Public Affairs. I am here at the online celebration of the 2021 Cherry Blossom Festival to say hello to the listeners and fans and talk about one of my favorite subjects, Godzilla. My comments represent my own views and are not intended to represent the views of the Cherry Blossom Festival or the Japanese American Association of Indiana. Kaijuvision is different from every other Godzilla podcast because this one's about what the Japanese were thinking when they made these movies and what the Japanese audience thought when they saw these movies. To me, it's about connecting kaiju movies to the real world rather than fanboying out just like other Godzilla podcasts and YouTube channels already do. I go and find the deeper meaning, which is what I think is really special about these movies. I'm going to talk about the very first Godzilla film from 1954, which I encourage everyone to see, especially if you're interested in things that are Japanese. This one still reigns supreme over the rest of the movies in the franchise, and why I think so is the topic of this talk. I'm going to talk about this movie in a different way than a lot of people do. Everyone already knows about the basic symbolism of Godzilla and how it represents nuclear warfare, but there are some things that fewer people know that I think are especially fascinating. First, why is there an offensive military in this movie at a time when Japan only had a small self-defense force? They had lost their military 9 years before this, and the military in the movie is unfettered by Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. This article outlaws Japan's use of war to settle international disputes. Armed forces with war potential will not be maintained. What is the symbolism behind this? It shows how useless Japan's military was against the United States in the war. They are no match for Godzilla. It's also commenting on how Japan was stripped of military power during the war. By depicting it, you're commenting on its absence. In 1954, the same year that the first Godzilla movie was released, the Self-Defense Forces were created under the Self-Defense Forces Act. The JSDF is still in existence today after all these years. In a short time, Japan went from having an aggressive and offensive military to having a defense force that isn't usually referred to as a military. The U.S. military is still the largest military force in Japan, and the United States is paid $2 billion a year by Japan for this protection. The self-defense forces primarily help Japan by performing disaster relief operations like during the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdowns. Next, we know about the atomic bomb symbolism in the movie, but is there something else in the movie that symbolized something that's maybe not mentioned as much? The damage Godzilla causes in Tokyo symbolizes the Tokyo firebombing more than the radioactivity of the aftermath of the atomic bombings. This isn't mentioned as much, but deserves to be mentioned. More Japanese people experienced that than the nuclear bombings. During the firebombing, 80,000 to 130,000 civilians were killed, and over 1 million were made homeless. This is compared to 108,000 dying in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is Tokyo burning that we see, after all. I see the atomic bombings being mentioned far more often than the firebombing of Tokyo, but it is important to make sure that these events are mentioned in tandem. Additionally, in the first movie, Godzilla's breath is much more like smoke. This is a reference to the smoke caused by the firebombing. The bombs that were used contained napalm, and some even contained gelled gasoline. The bombings created a firestorm, which made many civilians die from smoke inhalation. Next, what is the significance of the scene with the woman and her children that is absent from the 1956 American version of this movie? It's not just a scary moment, it has historical context. It's a comment on the targeting of Japanese civilians during the war. The U.S. took these measures because of Japan's refusal to surrender until so much time had passed and all of the destruction that occurred. But that's why it was cut for the American version, along with almost everything else political and many historical references. It's difficult to talk about the history behind the first Godzilla movie without addressing the reasons for Japan's surrender. Japan did not surrender just because of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A big reason why Japan surrendered is because the Soviet Union was invading Japan at the time. Starting on August 8, 1945, Soviet forces began invading the northern islands of Japan. The bombing of Hiroshima was on August 6, just 2 days before, and the bombing of Nagasaki was on August 9th. Japan surrendered on September 2nd. When Japan surrendered, they surrendered only to the United States. They did not surrender to the Allied forces, and it's important to make that distinction. The Allied forces, including the Soviet Union and China. By doing this, Japan was siding with the United States against the Soviet Union. Russia has still not returned sovereignty of the Japanese northern territories to Japan. If the Japanese had waited longer to surrender and the Soviets had invaded further south, they likely would have taken over enough of Japan to create a situation where there could have been a northern communist Japan and a south capitalist Japan. This would have been like the situation Korea endures. It's hard to imagine, but if the island of Hokkaido had been taken by the Soviets, or possibly even the northern part of the main island of Honshu, the Soviet Union would have used it as a military base to threaten the rest of Japan with, possibly as long as the entire Cold War lasted. Japan absolutely wanted to avoid this kind of situation at all costs. Therefore, they surrendered to just the United States. Next, what else about the symbolism of Godzilla itself? What else does it represent? Godzilla represents nuclear weapons, of course, but it also represents nuclear power, nuclear energy, nuclear proliferation, and the indiscriminate manner of killing that nuclear weapons involve. Godzilla also possibly represents the spirits of soldiers who died in the Pacific theater of World War II, which is commonly referred to in Japan as the Great Pacific War. This symbolism wouldn't be explored until 2001 in a Godzilla film called Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack. Godzilla also represents Japan's nuclear curse. 2 atomic bombings, the Japanese fishing vessel affected by the Castle Bravo nuclear test, the Fukushima nuclear meltdowns in 2011, and the struggle for Japanese energy independence. Japan has to rely on nuclear energy in order to generate enough power. To the Japanese creators of the movie, what was the purpose of making this in the first place? The movie allowed the Japanese to be victims instead of the aggressors. It allowed them to be angry about the damage done to their country, and it allowed them to be angry at the nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testing. This movie accomplished all of these things, all while not mentioning the United States directly and not being blatantly anti-American. It also allowed the Japanese to psychologically work through the trauma that they had experienced as a nation during the war. Getting back to the American version of this movie called Godzilla King of the Monsters from 1956, why were these political and historical references removed and subsequently replaced with scenes with the American actor Raymond Burr? These political references are the core of the original film, in my opinion. The editors decided to remove the vast majority of these references while letting the monster action stay in because these references were expressing what I call the Japanese national spirit. This includes opinions that I have already talked about, including how the Japanese in the movie are the victims and not the aggressors, and how the Japanese were able to express their anger at the United States for all that happened to them. It's not that I think the edited version of this movie is bad per se, but I prefer to see the real thing as much as I like Raymond Burr and his performance. Did anyone read about how the Japanese audiences in the theaters cheered when the National Diet Building, where the Parliament meets, was destroyed by Godzilla? Why did they do this? This was the only time that they cheered in the theater. Because they were ambivalent to the government in general. The government that got them into the war and their country largely destroyed, as well as the government that was set up by the U.S. after the war. They were fed up with bureaucrats and fed up with bickering politicians. They were fed up with problems not being solved. If you want to learn more about the kinds of issues that are covered in Godzilla movies, some of which are not overtly referenced, there are over 50 episodes of Kaijuvision available for listening or viewing. I would also recommend William Tsutsui's book called Godzilla on My Mind. He is the greatest academic in America in the Godzilla world. You can follow Kaijuvision on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Kaijuvision is available on kaijuvision.com, YouTube, and anywhere podcasts are found. I'm Brian Scherschel, and this is Kaijuvision. See you next time.